Okay, good afternoon. So we've had a really amazing set of sessions earlier today talking about the science of smart cities that Jim just moderated. We had remarks from our sponsors. We had Raj talk about the vision for Metro21. This is really, to my mind, perhaps one of the most important sessions in our event today, which has to do with how are we going to pay for having these smart city deployments actually be made? How are we actually going to make it happen? Not just the financial model, but what are the various means by which we're going to make it happen? And as you heard in the Dean's panel, we talked about the fact that we have this amazing test bed here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. We talked about this partnership between the city, the county, the public sector, the private sector, the foundations, and the university to do piloting and demonstration, the R&D approach. What we want to talk about today with a really esteemed group of panelists that I'll introduce in just a minute is really to sort of ask the question, how might we think about public-private partnerships as a particular mechanism to realize some of the benefits and opportunities that these technologies present to us. So the panelists that I have here, let me give a one-sentence introduction and have them then speak about this question from their point of view. Lee Haller, Director of Innovation and Performance, City of Pittsburgh. So a little round of applause. Katharine Eagan Kelleman, who joined us, who's on the other end. Chief Allegheny County Port Authority CEO. Richard Riazzi, President and CEO of Duquesne Light. Frank Sgambati, Director of Business Development from Bosch. And Jim Young, CEO of, Chief Operating Officer of Crown Castle. So with this context setting that I did, I'm going to turn this over to the panelists, and we'll go pretty much in the order of introduction, though they're not quite seated in that order. We'll bump and bounce around. So I'll turn this over to Lee to kick things off. Lee.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. What I thought I would do is start out by talking a little bit about the Department of Innovation and Performance to provide some context for kind of where I'm coming from in some of my comments on the panel today. So the Department of Innovation and Performance with the city is 4 years old. And we recently went through a strategic planning effort as a department to really hone what it is that our department should be focused on doing. And our mission as a department is to elevate the work of city government. So we are not a department that's out fighting fires, plowing streets, filling potholes, inspecting buildings, doing any of those services. But we're the department with the technology professionals and other professionals that should be helping to improve those services. So whether it's introducing new technologies to make those services more efficient and more effective, we also have a portion of our staff that is focused on engagement. So social media, web, cable, and print, talking about all of the good things that the employees of the city of Pittsburgh are doing. So that's kind of where we're coming from in terms of the mission of the organization. As part of our strategic planning effort, one of the other things just to keep in mind is that we feel like one of the core roles that we can play as a department is to be technical stewards for the city of Pittsburgh. So historically, we have 19 different departments in the city of Pittsburgh. Historically, there hasn't really been a very strong governance model around technology investments across those 19 different departments. And as a result, we have a fairly substantial amount of technical debt. We've made big investments in systems that were scoped out by one of those 19 departments and not really considering the needs of other departments. So, it's a challenge for us to kind of work our way out of that technical debt. But I come to the topic of smart city implementations from that standpoint, that we have to be very cautious about the investments that we make as a city, because clearly our motivations are protecting taxpayer dollars and making sure the investments that we make have the maximum benefit for the citizens of Pittsburgh. I think that there's definitely room for partnerships with university and with private sector. We love working with Metro21, but I think the challenge from the city standpoint is that we really need to start with the business need and work our way back to what technology is best to meet that very specific business need. The smart city space and kind of the way that city politics works, sometimes the smart city things are the sexy, flashy things that everybody wants to talk about. And so we go all in on investments on those things, but we really haven't thought at the heart of it, what is the business challenge that we're trying to meet? So that's what we're trying to do as a department, and I can provide some examples of how we're trying to do that in future comments.
Thank you, Lee. Katharine?
Good afternoon, and again, thank you for having us. Thank you for the invitation. Who in here has taken transit in Pittsburgh in the last month? So that's why I have a job. Thank you. Thanks very much. I am wrapping up week number 7 as the CEO at the Port Authority. So I will be less helpful on the conversation of what the Port Authority has done and more helpful in the conversation of where I was previously. It was Tampa, it's a small city, but we, to broadly paraphrase Shakespeare, we were small, but we were fierce. Mm-hmm. You have to try harder when you have no money and no resources. Transit in its best use is something you don't notice. It removes friction. Good afternoon, Carly. It makes your life happen. It makes all the points come together. In 3 years, my goal is we're not saying about Port Authority or what's going on. It's Port Authority was a great partner at a community event, or moving forward into a very cool MWBE training program because the transportation portion is so seamless. Nearly 250,000 people a day take transit here in Pittsburgh. I'm wearing boots. I started off my morning at the incline. Who has taken the incline? So I was digging around. There's 2 sets of brakes. That was very reassuring since I've taken my children on it. But we range from the incline to the T, and where can that go? The old trolley system, and then buses. There's all sorts of cool new stuff coming down, which I'm hopeful I'll hear about, especially from Bosch. We don't need to try to compete with that, and we wouldn't be good at it. We need to focus on what we do well and leave the door open to be supportive, almost as an equity partner in a lot of our smart cities and emerging technology. So how can we help it come together, and how can we get out of the way? Because honestly, doing our governmental equity thing is sort of the opposite, like the Venn diagram of being creative in government. That's us. So how can we connect this really big base of passengers and become the most attractive place for anybody in the country, especially here in Pittsburgh? If you're doing something new with transportation, you should never have to leave to give it a test drive. So that's the nutshell. And again, thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Katharine. Richard.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me here as well. As we think about smart cities and public-private partnerships, to what Leah said a little bit earlier, we kind of approach it from what's the problem we're trying to solve, and then put the teams together to figure out what the solution is. So setting that aside, as we think about smart cities and how that may play into a public-private partnership, it's what each of the parties bring to the table. And when we think about smart cities, we think about what are the 3 pillars that kind of underpin what's going to be required to make that successful. The first pillar we think about is you got to cost effectively gather all the data that's out there. So that's infrastructure intensive, and that's a lot of devices that have to go in the field. The second thing that we think about is you got to deliver the data to the cloud. So what's the communication backbone and infrastructure that's going to get it up to the cloud? Then the third pillar we think about is the application development. Who's going to develop the apps? How are they going to have access to that data? How are they going to turn that into meaningful information that could really, add value at the end of the day? So when we think about it, things that we do as a utility that we think we do well is we build and operate networks. We have a lot of assets in the field now. We have poles that can be used for various devices. Depending on the nature of the municipality, the city of Pittsburgh owns their own streetlights, but we own the streetlights and all of the other municipalities are out there. So we have those assets that are into the field. We have a lot of technology across our system. We're really good at operating the SCADA system that we have with thousands of devices that are measuring in real time the flow of electrical energy, and then switching schemes to run the system very reliably and very safe. And then we have the communication backbone that goes across that as well, that takes all that data back to our control rooms and to where we apply logic to it. We're deemed a critical infrastructure company, so other things you think about is the security of the data. So, we have really perfected a lot of practices internally to keep the system secure, cyber secure, so to speak. So I think as we think about public partnerships, there'll be a lot of us sitting here at the table that bring different assets to the table. I think we have to think about how do we not replicate what's in the field? How do we take advantage of existing assets that are there in such a way that we can leverage them, to make this become more of a sustainable reality.
Thank you, Richard. Frank.
Good afternoon, and I thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to be here to represent Bosch. We're very excited to speak on the topic of smart cities. How many people in the audience have a Bosch appliance? Oh, very nice. How many have Bosch power tools? Oh, better yet. How many have an electronic stability control in their car? Oh, this is impressive. All right, the last one. How many have a industrial-sized, let's say, hydraulics in their home? Aha, I got you. So what I'm trying to say is that we have a broad, I'd say, spectrum of products and solutions that we can offer to the market. We not only can bring the hardware, we can bring the software. We have 4 business sectors, and those what I just mentioned to you in the test to draw from. We see smart cities as an opportunity to work at a level where we've not been involved in. So for us, smart cities is a new endeavor. I've been in this role for about a year. We've been doing smart cities for about 6 years on a global basis. Even though we're a $97 billion company, 130 years young, this is a new space for us. So we're very excited. We do see the public-private partnerships as one of the key avenues to actually deploy some of the technologies we can bring to the market. We see other avenues of ways to do that, and I'll discuss that in a little bit later in my comments. But where I just want to talk about, we are active in 14 different what we call beacon projects around the world. A couple of them are local. In fact, we did quote the RFP for the networked LED lights for the city of Pittsburgh. We're excited about that. And we're also working with other cities in the U.S. and in Canada to try and bring some of these solutions. So we do see there's a lot of energy around the topic. We do see there's also some impediments having to do with funding. I think there was a lot of good discussions this morning about how maybe certain ways of funding these projects can be taken on. But I think from our perspective, we're a technology solutions provider. We have what we call our slogan, we're invented for life. But ultimately, what we're striving for is quality of life for citizens in communities and cities that we do projects in.
Thank you, Frank. Jim.
Great. Just to save everybody the trouble, how many people have any idea who Crown Castle is? Oh, wow. That's awesome. Was that from an earlier presentation? Perhaps, Chris? Great. So you know that we're about shared telecommunications infrastructure. That's what we do. The second pillar that Mr. Riazzi talked about is exactly where we are. And we have a really strong belief that the best infrastructure to deploy is that infrastructure that can be shared. That is the most effective economic use of that infrastructure. And we believe that that will be very prominent as we move forward in a smart city environment. We've done a number of projects with cities around the country in deploying different aspects of smart city and providing that connective tissue that really powers a lot of the infrastructure. We're not the cameras, we're not the software. It's very similar to what Richard talked about, is it's the stuff that you don't see. I guarantee you everybody that checked their cell phone today ran over a lot of Crown Castle infrastructure and probably some of Richard's infrastructure. At least charge your phone with his, nothing else today, right? So we have been exposed to a lot of different funding approaches to these kinds of projects. I think what's important, I think we all realize this, is the models have to be adaptive. There is not one model for Pittsburgh that will be the exact same model for Tampa. It's got to be adapted to the situation, the priorities of of the location, of the jurisdiction, the city that's exploring those things. And we absolutely believe that connective tissue and that infrastructure, of which there is not enough. I can promise you that however much we have today, and we have a lot in Pittsburgh, we have a lot of infrastructure in Pittsburgh. I'm not just talking Crown, but our community has a lot of infrastructure. But some of the demands for data transport that come with things like autonomous vehicles, the latency requirements that Satya undoubtedly talked about in his presentation, that requires a lot of infrastructure. And it is no small investment. It's a significant investment, but it's one that I think best made in partnership with an eye towards all the uses and the best ways to deploy that infrastructure so it can be used by a variety of interested parties, both public and private, I think has the best opportunity and the best way forward for us as we embark on this project.
Thank you, Jim. First thing is, I want to thank each and every one of you for the partnership with Metro21. We have the public sector, technology solution providers, infrastructure providers. The second is an observation. You know, when we had the deans here, Karen had to flash this thing about, you know, please conclude, you're running out of time. None of that. I mean, they all came in on time or underneath time. And so you can tell these folks are about, you know, being able to make their points and effectively. Which now, you know, no pressure. So now I want to sort of seed the discussion with a few questions and then sort of open it up for discussion. Before we get to the, you know, several of you talked about particular examples of deployments and other things you've done with creative and adaptive models of public-private partnerships. But if you take a step back and ask the question, how might we use your infrastructure, the technologies, to really meet the real needs of citizens to improve their quality of life, to maximize the benefits, if you will, of what it is your firms and your technology solution providers are bringing to their. How might we go about doing that? And from your experience, from each of your different perspectives, from the public sector, the private sector, what do you see as a big constraint that needs to be overcome? Go ahead.
So you want me to start first?
Sure.
So as we look at our infrastructure in the field, as I indicated a little bit earlier, you know, we do have the poles that are out there. We do have the street lights that are out there that sensing equipment can be mounted on. When you look at the regulatory model that we have currently, it really doesn't lend itself to that. You know, there would have to be some regulatory changes, you know, that we would have to implement at the PUC, which regulates us, that gets us more into, instead of this cost of service notion where you get a return on your equity, where it could be more market-based pricing, where we could sit out there and say, you know, we have an asset, we can leverage it, we can put additional devices on there, and we can sell the data as a service or have access to it for some fee of some sort. I mean, we haven't actually sat down and thought that through. You know, like any other publicly held or privately held company, our investors expect a return. So when you look at the regulatory model, when you start to venture into areas that generate additional revenue, when you go in for your base business, they use that as a revenue offset to what you would be requiring with a rate increase, which theoretically means you're taking on more operational risk and you get no reward for that operational risk. So the model has to change to attract the capital from our investor base to be able to leverage infrastructure that we have already in the field.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, and I think from the city standpoint, we're obviously fairly infrastructure rich in that we own, in most cases, all of the traffic poles at every intersection in the city, thousands and thousands of, not necessarily all the telephone poles where our streetlights are mounted, but we have many decorative light poles that we own. We have public buildings that we own all over the city. So we have a lot of infrastructure that's well spread out across the city that could be leveraged for implementations like this. I mean, our smart PGH application to the U.S. Department of Transportation envisioned taking advantage of that in certain smart corridors. I think the challenge for us is, and kind of our interest is making sure that the data backhaul is there, and it's something that is open and can be built on for future applications. So as our streetlight implementation as an example, we're trying to make sure that as part of that process, we're opening the door for future implementations and providing an infrastructure that will provide the data backhaul for future smart city implementations, and not just considering this one particular use case around the streetlight conversion. So that's kind of been a challenge for us, is figuring out the right way to go forward with that.
Maybe I can talk a little bit about where we're coming from as a technology provider. Some of the sensors, for example, video sensors, there was a lot of talk today about what video can do. I mean, it's not just a video. I think really it's the edge computing that was talked about, even the cloud computing, but I think it's really the analytics that you can derive and the data that you can derive from sensors like video cameras. And I'm not talking the video itself, it's what we would call the metadata. So I think it was described as the little pixels and those devices, but things like counting people, you know, we can do traffic counting, we can also do a lot of different things, but what we would provide as the technology solutions provider is the data source. So our sensors that would be put up on, whether it's utility poles or it's street lights, can provide the data input. And a lot of these sensors, to be quite honest, have come from our mobility sector. And that is our largest business sector within the Bosch group. A lot of these sensors are very robust. They've been developed for extreme environments. But they're also very cost effective because the base microsensors that go into them are built in volumes of millions, in some cases tens of millions. So where we see we can offer for a more cost effective solution, again, is taking advantage of the existing infrastructure, adding these additional sensors, but it's really deriving the data that other policies and planning decisions could be made.
And we're on the flip side of that. So in the past few years, one of the big topics in transportation is why can't you do more business with Uber and Lyft? And they have an excellent application, and we shouldn't compete with that because they just do it better. But it's been very challenging for entities that do partner with them to get data back because, you know, from my perspective, their value is in the data that they're collecting. Like, there's not a thing about me that Lyft doesn't know, and that's got a lot of value, especially if it follows me past the end of my location. So, of course, that's their money. They don't want to share it. But as a public entity, I need to know where those trips are beginning and ending. So our challenge many times has been leaving our platform open so we can facilitate some service or some interchange back and forth. But we need to know exactly how that's being used. So I think there's a recurrent theme is maybe we're swimming in data and finding that which is useful and winnowing in on that. Maybe that's our common challenge.
Jim, did you have a...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I talked earlier, and bandwidth is huge. Lee talked about that, having the right bandwidth to move all this data around. And we know that eventually, either at data ingest or when the data is processed back out and used to actually make a deployment of some sort, whether it's a Lyft or an Uber or a bus, that data is going to travel wirelessly. And today, it's really difficult to deploy wireless broadband. And the deployments that are most important in an urban environment and even a suburban environment are small cell deployments. And I echo some of Richard's comments, the regulatory environment is not good, does not facilitate that, mostly through lack of policy. I'm speaking initially generically because it applies really to most jurisdictions around the country. And where we've seen the best success is working towards a joint regulatory policy that makes it easy to deploy that bandwidth. So all the infrastructure that my colleagues up here have mentioned, there are buildings, there's poles, that's great. But if especially the private entity that's deploying that infrastructure can't make it through a zoning and permitting process in less than 24 months, it becomes an inhibitor to move all the data around that we want to do. So I think, yeah.
If I want to do business with AV and it takes like 4 terabytes of data.
Yes, exactly.
And it's clearly not plugged in anywhere. That's
right.
Yeah.
That's right. So we've had discussions with a lot of partners in Pittsburgh about, we have terabytes of data to move. How can you help us? Now, terabytes is a little beyond wireless at this point, but it won't be beyond wireless forever. And that's where the fiber assets that we've talked about come into play. So having a part of the partnership is building a regulatory environment that is not without regulation. I'm certainly not arguing for that at all, but just getting to a point where, because it's highly transactional and repetitive, right? And if we can get a construct in the policy that enables infrastructure to be deployed easily and quickly to meet the needs really driven by the jurisdiction, in this case the city, I think that's really a path to success.
So it's a great kickoff to the discussion. I mean, so there are two sort of points being made. I think one relates to sort of a different approach to regulation. On the one hand, allowing for the private entity to be able to recover market prices, but at the same time providing the public entity with capacity to use it for other use cases than for the particular use case. And then to Karen's point, the question of who owns the data. This came up in an earlier discussion as well related to the citizens own the data, does the public entity own the data, but if so, then how does the private service provider monetize their services? So there's an interesting set of tensions in this, and we're going to have this solved in 20 minutes, but I just wanted to sort of, in terms of framing the discussion, are there other let me turn this to the audience and see if there are other questions that the audience has in this regard about public-private partnerships, either in the context of the regulatory frameworks that they've started out the discussion with, or in regard to other points that you'd like to raise. Any questions from the audience? Yep, go ahead, on that side. Yes, sir, Don.
Yeah, in terms of public-private academic partnerships, exchanging data, transparency of data, video cameras, sensors all over the place, there's the problem that Anthony Townsend calls the basket of remotes problem, which is we all have 3 or 4 remotes at home to control our TV, our DVD player, our sound system, and they don't talk to each other. There's always this thing, is there a universal remote that really works? So the same thing happens with exchange of data, with equipment, hard data, soft data, whatever it might be. Talk about how you think that can be resolved from your points of view as really suppliers of many of these services that we need to do in order to understand and create a smart city.
Maybe I could start a little bit. The data is, for us, is key to, I think, a smart city. We've all kind of agreed on that. But from our perspective, the data can also mean new business models. So from our perspective, whatever sensors we provide data to and from, we believe in open data sources. Because we can actually develop, and we have developed solutions that are app-based. For example, we're looking at ways to bring together multiple, you mentioned the basket of remotes, but if you look at it from a basket of apps, it's the same problem. So you're coming into a city and you want to use multimodal transportation and you want it all in one app, excuse me. So we've developed some solutions where we can bring together pieces from an Uber or pieces from a Car2Go and make it in one app. And not only is it one app, but you can do the process, so it's a multimodal approach. Now, it's not perfect, but we're seeing the same benefits with data being available for all of us to come up with, better solutions for cities. And that, to us, it makes more sense than a closed data system.
I'd say definitely for standards. Back in about 2009, 2010, once Google had cleaned up their maps enough so they wouldn't tell you, for instance, get off a subway and then connect to a street you couldn't get to, we could all push our data out in our GTFS, and all of our data was streamlined and everyone was using the same format. And so what goes into Google to tell you what bus to take was the same format that these app developers could grab and go. And that made life very easy for us. Now, when we have one app that wants a data formatted this way, or I've got it coming out of my vehicle locator system in a different format, it makes my life so much easier for my IT team just to scrub it down to one standard. And then beyond that, I kid that there's a 12-year-old messing around in her parents' basement waiting to write my next app. But I really believe this is the case. And a good example of this in San Francisco, Bay Area Transit and Muni just post all their open source data, and then they let people build all the apps that they want, which goes into a security constraint and a security concern of how open is your system, how much money are you investing in your firewalls and your cybersecurity, and is it worth it to do that, to leave the data open? I'll leave that up to the folks who know what they're talking about, which I totally don't. But as a public entity, we can make life so much easier if we just came to a standard for the data that we're pushing out, but then that we have to bring back to consume. That would save a lot of your tax dollars. And to the point on data ownership, our philosophy is if taxpayers have funded it, it belongs ultimately to a taxpayer. Now, does that mean that an individual person wants to have all our data? No, but they should be able to get it from us in a really reasonable time frame. I mean, aside from disciplinary records or legally confidential stuff, it should all be open because you've already paid for it.
I would add that, and this will be a little bit of the negative side of the opportunity, let's call it that. I think that's more appropriate. the Internet of Things right now is really early days in terms of cybersecurity. And what we have to know is, and you all know this, any device that's connected to the web is an access point for the bad guys. And Frank, you probably have something to add to this because that's part of the business, and I welcome that. But no. I'm just saying. You think about our early computers. There was no cybersecurity concerns when we first connected to the web. Well, now we're doing hundreds of billions of devices will connect to the web in the next 10 years. Every piece, as you know, every piece of electronic that you buy, including your electric toothbrush, will be connected to the web. I'm not saying that the bad guys will get in through our toothbrushes, but we have to be very thoughtful as a community about what, and I'm just talking the sensors. I'm not even talking data. The data, everything said about data, I completely agree with. But just even the protocols and the security of the devices we're putting out there is a real significant concern. And there are a lot of people working on that, but it is by no means settled science at this point.
I guarantee everyone in this room has had that thing where you're talking to someone and you pick up your phone to Google, and your phone is already telling you what you were looking for. We've all had that. That's just coincidental, right? Yeah.
What I would add is that what we have targeted is all of our electronic devices will be connected by 2020. And we're talking millions of devices. So we've actually, I think it was in 2012, we bought a company called Sgambati, which was a small startup out of Germany, and their focus is cybersecurity. And so this is another company that, again, was developed and bought in regard to the mobility sector because we were connecting all the vehicles and connected cars. But now we're looking at it in exactly the light you're saying, is that all of these devices will be connected. It's not only the security purposes, but there's privacy, so anonymity. So once we collect all of this data, it should be anonymous data. And so one of the areas that we're now bringing to cities is our Sgambati. It's a group that looks at this topic specifically. So it's a need because it will happen.
That's great.
So just to follow up on that, I mean, Helsinki, for instance, has Frank, the app that provides you multimodal access into, and if you use that as a metaphor, and I'll come back to the shared infrastructure of backhaul and other, using that same example, it provides consumers with low search costs in the sense that they have this one app into all the different services. However, and it potentially reduces barriers to entry for new service providers to come in. However, the incumbents whose model is based on large network effects don't really like to plug into a system like that because it sort of hurts their model because you use Uber as an app because there are a lot of drivers on the Uber platform and vice versa. There are a lot of people wanting to drive for Uber because a lot of people who have downloaded the Uber app. So there's this two-sided network effect. So I was wondering if you had a comment about that in light of this idea of the shared infrastructure to multimodal via one app.
No, certainly. So to be quite frank, it hasn't been easy to get the data. I mean, that has clearly been a struggle because some of the partners we're working with are very eager to expand their services. Many of them are smaller than, let's say, the larger players. But even in regard with the larger players, what we've realized, or what they've realized, is when you do have the ability to bring them more business, and it's a more seamless, frictionless process, they also see the benefits. We have a couple pilots that we're doing in Europe, one in Stuttgart, and we've had good success, but it's been limited, again, based on the number of partners, because if it doesn't have all of the modes of transportation, it really doesn't make any sense. So it is a struggle. I mean, there is a challenge, but it's possible, I would say, if all of the players are benefiting in some sort from a, let's say, a monetary perspective.
Krishna?
Yeah. Yes, Raj.
So let me second Krishnan earlier when he said that you've been supportive and cooperative with Metro21, so we thank you for your support. But I thought this panel was really an excellent composition, if you will. 2 public sector representatives, 2 from private companies, and 1 from a public company, right? So I think it's a very interesting mix. So I'm wondering whether the panelists would be willing to share 1 or more success stories where working with a public entity or to make a city smarter, things worked out, and you would like to share the magic sauce of why it worked.
And why it didn't also.
That's my second part of the question. If you're willing to share something that did not quite work, you can abstract any details if you do not want to share that. It will be very useful as well. Right? Success stories and then failure stories, if you're willing to share.
I'll give you a failure first. How's that? Because most of us like to start with success. So we do have a success story. My last agency created a ride-sharing app. The story that goes into it is best told over sangria, and it involves someone who Breaking Bad went off the air and he got bored and he went to drive for Lyft, and that's the introduction. So we have success stories. It's 62-year-old man from Iowa. It gets like the story gets better, but there is no sangria. I think one of the failures for public entities is I don't say we don't know what we don't know. That's really cliche. We are painfully ignorant of what we need to be asking to adapt our public processes. So public procurements are they're cumbersome, but they are very conservative. And the intent is to make sure everyone has the opportunity to get the money back from the entity. This is great for buying widgets or certain types of services, but when it comes to trying to figure out which of the vendors are willing to come and demo an AV shuttle is best, how on earth would I or my team know anything about that? Like, so we're as smart as we can be, but to get people onto an evaluation panel, for instance, that know something, they're all the competition. So it becomes difficult in that public procurement process to get good technical skills to help us evaluate. So my last entity did an award for an AV contract last fall, and the prime firm had an excellent reputation, been around forever, but the vehicle itself was a firm that had been around, 5-10 years. They didn't have that particular vehicle in production, but they had a good track record, and the public procurement process doesn't let you ding them for them not having it. If they say they can, you have to assume that they can. So we had a prototype delivered in November, and the prototype was like a high school prop, like not even a college prop. There were scuff marks on a prop that could not roll. So I just want us to think about that. And they had film on the window so you couldn't see in, but when you saw in, it was a shell. And the embarrassment of it was the competitor was zipping behind them autonomously. So the next step was to require a working prototype, and they sent one on a flatbed, and I would make a joke about it being like Legos, but it was really like they sent all the components. They just weren't put together. And had we been able to dig more in the industry, we would have had people say, oh yeah, those guys. But we didn't know. So we ended up carrying the contract, went with a different vendor, lost 2 months, lost some of the public money. So I'd say that is one of the failures is our procurement models of trying to work for us are they're not dynamic enough for us not to be inadvertently stupid. Please don't quote me on that. But the success story is more fun than the car and parts.
I'll start with a great success story, one that is a classic example of when priority is aligned, how much can be done, how quickly. So a couple years ago, let me set the stage first. Having the proper bandwidth to enable this infrastructure is very dependent on when you need it to work the most. And when you need it to work the most is when there's an event, like a playoff game or a security incident, right? That's when everybody gets on their phone and data starts moving like crazy. So we had an opportunity, when the Pope visited Philadelphia a couple years ago, we were contacted by all of the big 4 wireless carriers saying, hey, we don't have capacity, we need to get small cells in Philadelphia now. We approached the city. They recognized this is a big event. It's a big security event, and people need wireless access, at least to take their selfies with the Pope Mobile in the background, which worked. I told you before, it takes usually 24 months at best to get our small cells deployed. In less than 6 months, right down the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia, we deployed, I think, close to 100 small cells for each of the carriers, and the event came off perfectly. That's a success story. I'll tell you a less than successful story where we had deployed small cells in a community on the North Shore of Long Island. If you've ever been there, that says a lot about regulatory challenge. We went through 5 years of regulatory environment, got our approvals, deployed per the approvals. After we put the infrastructure up, the municipality decided they didn't like it, and they took it down. They took it down, not they asked us to take it down, they took it down. That's a disaster. Disaster. And so that tail continues to spin. But those different juxtaposition of very willing and eager community to partner, community not so eager, makes all the difference in the world.
Lee?
Yeah, I think not so much a private industry city example that I have to share, but I think a university city example that I could share is the work that we've done around the SureTrack deployment in the East End, right? So that's an instance where we were using city infrastructure at, 50 different intersections to pilot out technology that was developed here at Carnegie Mellon. It meets a definite business need that the city has, right? The East End is a growing area of the city, a lot of traffic congestion issues. And it gave us a platform for trying out pretty cutting edge technology in the public realm. So that's something that I would highlight as a great example of where university city collaboration can really yield some benefits.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, so give two examples, one that's just unfolding as we're sitting here, and then another from a past life. So we just made an announcement that we continue to expand our electric vehicle program. So one of the things that we're doing, if you think about it as an electric utility, it's all about voltages, right? We're raising voltages up and down to move power across the system, which is basically a transformer. A charging station is basically for an electric vehicle. A transformer, we're good at installing, maintaining, and operating those type devices. So some of the things that we're doing is we are looking and partnering, with some of the municipalities here as they start thinking about converting their fleets, that we would put in and own and install, or we would own and operate the charging station. So when you think about that from a municipality, it allows them to stretch their dollars further, to take those dollars and apply them to vehicle purchases rather than the charging infrastructure. In a past life, public partnership that we forged with a county and a city out on the West Coast. As an electric utility, as you can imagine, with aging infrastructure and replacing your infrastructure, some of that is below ground. Some of that obviously is just, changing out aging poles and reconductoring. One of the challenges that we faced out there was that we would go in and we'd set all new poles, and then 2 or 3 months later, the county would come out and say, we want to widen the road and move all your poles that you just put in that have been 2 months. Or likewise, we'd cut the road and redo it, and then they'd come back and, want to widen the road, and, we'd have to take our electrical conduits and make them deeper. So it was a painstaking process to get alignment between our two planning groups to be able to coordinate that better. That took more than 1.5 years to really hone the processes, but once we got it right, we had very few instances where we were making investments and then having the county or the city coming in and with a decision to widen a road that they knew about at the time we were doing it, and then we'd have to move that infrastructure. So if you think about it, it's all the same constituents, right? So at the end of the day, that causes our costs to go up, which are the same constituents the city or the municipality is dealing with.
Great example. I've already gotten the double thumbs up sign from Karen, but Frank, last word for you.
Really, just a quick story. And this was a project that, and we use it internally as a lessons learned. That was done in Singapore, where we stood up an electric vehicle charging network with multiple charge point operators, and I think in the end it was 74 different charging point stations. I think it was 3 or 4 different vendors. Everything went well. It stood up. It was 2011. It operated for, I think, 2 years. Everybody was very happy. But the problem was there was no electric vehicles.
Sounds like something awesome.
So kind of a success failure story. But we learned a lot, and we do use it internally as a lessons learned. And we hope to take some of those lessons learned and deploy those in cities.
So that's a great story to end on, because I hope you learned a lot. And there's beer and pizza coming up. Is that?
I have a few more thoughts.
And before the beer and pizza, there are closing thoughts. Sorry to put you under some pressure here, Karen. But please join me in thanking the panelists.